everybody. How are you doing today? I'm going to be doing something a bit different to start off this review. I'm going to be demonstrating exactly how long The Wandering Inn is, visually on the desk. So without any further ado, let's begin. The Wandering Inn is longer than all of the first 10 books of Malazan, and my brothers and sisters in Christ were not even halfway there. Lord of the Rings, which doesn't even really put a dent in it. It just kind of feels right to have Lord of the Rings amongst all these fantasy series that are going to be here. All 5 of Song of Ice and Fire books. The entirety of First Law. Let's just add a little bit of His Dark Materials for spice. The Expanse, which, fun fact, I originally did this count thinking we were still at 12 million. We're over that after the last updated word count drop. Jesus. And if we top it all off with some spicy spice, we are now reasonably as close as I can imagine getting with the books on my desk to The Wandering Inn's current word count. Oh wait, no, I double checked the math, and guess what? I have an opportunity here to add in Neon Ghosts, available at shop.wraithmark.com. I think we're actually still a tiny bit short, so I'm gonna throw some murder on that bitch, and I think now we're at it. And I am not demonstrating this as a critique. I am purely doing this to help you all as readers set an expectation. This is what I am going to be labeling stream of consciousness fantasy. And just to add a bit of information I forgot to in this take, if you average out since its original publication date, July of 2016, how many words have been put out since then? Pirate ABBA has been averaging roughly 3,000 words a day for their fans. And shout out to Pirate ABBA, their team at least, who I was actually in touch with while working on this review, and despite my very plentiful criticisms, they were nothing but just amazing. So shout out to them. Let's get into the review. But today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform. Oh, I just knocked the camera. We're gonna keep that take. Here to help educate and encourage entrepreneurs to succeed online. Whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything from products to content to time. Not only can you learn the tips and tricks of your trade, but Squarespace is here to provide you with all the features that allow you to get as much out of your website as quickly as possible. Their asset library allows you to upload, organize, and access all your content from one place, as well as manage all your files from one central hub and use them across the entire Squarespace platform. And for anyone who does not have a background like myself in coding, Squarespace's flexible website template provides you with a list of professional designs for every category of use. Every. And this is related to my favorite aspect, the Fluid Engine, which allows you to do your Tony Stark thing to customize your layout and make your website reflect your creative soul for your audience. Go ahead and unlock that creativity like never before. I don't know what that was, like I opened my chest and there's a light. I don't know, that's kind of what I was going for there. So head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to make your first purchase of a website or domain, go to squarespace.com/Daniel Green for 10% off your first purchase. And just get your business up and running today. What are you waiting for? It just gets more competitive with every second that passes. There, it got a little more competitive. Oh, again, God! So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, there is an interesting story here, obviously. The Wandering Inn is a fantasy series that has been released serially online and is indie published. And every bit of baggage you are assuming is going to come with a series like this is absolutely here.
I've got a lot of problems.
It kind of even tells a story in the quality of how this story is being told. Getting into it, Pirate ABA has been releasing The Wandering Inn, as I mentioned, since July of 2016. And from what I can tell, it started as an independent venture, but as success has been found, the IP has been built up with a team around it. It follows the story of Erin and several other characters we actually follow the perspective of as well, as she takes over an abandoned inn and starts gaining levels in the class of innkeeper, keeping it spoiler free, which is a pretty great premise. I like having an innkeeper as a central character. It takes a common trope we are all familiar with and finally shines a spotlight on them. And they're in a world that is fairly typical modern high fantasy, meaning, yes, there are the things like goblins you expect, but there's also an emphasis on some slightly more popular modern fantasy races, as well as inclusions of things like ant people. And aside from my made-up genre I'm using to kind of analyze this series, it is actually fairly hardcore cozy fantasy vibes, though there's some graphic violence and disturbing scenes along the way, as well as mentions of sexual assault, murder, and etc., etc. It's adult cozy fantasy. And this series, while being one of the longest things ever written, has also begun to seriously build its momentum success in recent years, especially over the pandemic. That being said, I'm fairly confident the fans that are growing, and a large base, are going to be rather understanding to people who say this is just not quite their cup of tea. One, because it is cozy fantasy, and it's kind of strange to have a fan base within cozy fantasy that's like, what do you mean you don't like Legends and Lattes? First of all, she likes Pepsi more than Coke, which is objectively wrong. But on top of that, we have to spend a notable section of time as a reader listening to her thirst after Pepsi, maybe Coke, maybe Gatorade, maybe all three together. But also, there are surface level flaws, the most egregious of which I'm going to use to kind of help you understand what is to come here. The first 10 chapters, I think you could reduce down to about 20 pages. And in the audiobook I was listening to, they were more like 8 to 12 hours, at least it felt about that long. But by the time I got to the end of the first volume, which no, this is not a review of the full 12 million word series. I don't know if I read that many words last year, at least for books I reviewed. I read the first volume. But within that first volume, after that first 10 chapters, I was about ready to put this down and give it a near 0 out of 10 review. I aggressively did not like the start of The Wandering Inn. I felt like it was genuinely wasting my time, and I mean that as harshly as I can. But from there, it did begin to improve. Not to the point where I'm about to start touting this as a new favorite, but as something that is uniquely interesting. Because how this story is presented and how the narrative develops does kind of just at least start in this first volume like a stream of consciousness. Like almost nothing hits the editing room floor and we are just in for the ride. It is a roller coaster of cozy fantasy where not only are you left wondering if conflict will begin at a certain point, don't worry, it does about chapter 11, 12, but also if the thing you're currently experiencing is going to build in an interesting way or be reduced to a cheap joke, surface level conflict that's resolved in a scene, or be kind of just forgotten. This ties in with early on continuity errors and characterization that comes across like the most obnoxious anime characters possible, and the end result is, at first, something that feels immensely disposable. Aaron was just shocked to discover 3 things. That fish are heavy, that kitchen have knife, and that fish smell. We are now on chapter 7. Aaron is still puttering around the inn, having told us basically nothing about herself. There's been a fish that had leaked its guts, she's cut her own hand open, and maybe a skeleton's walking around. All of this, and she spent time wondering how a bug could have 4 legs and not 6. Ma'am, you've watched magic happen. But then, you can start actually watching, telling your own story, if you will, the author improve. And I actually have permission to say this here because I put out a tweet as I was starting this book, basically saying like, this bad, like why is this popular, holy crap. But then apparently Pirate ABA or someone on their team saw this and reached out and let me know they're aware that there are some very early on issues with The Wandering Inn, and there's actually going to be an updated version to make the entry point a little bit easier for people, which is something authors, I think, are completely allowed to do. I'm actually literally doing that with my first 2 books, Rebels Creed and Breach of Peace. There was a special edition done where I re-edited them after what I learned with Neon Ghosts, and now they hit harder. We're in the age of the internet, but this has also been done to books since all the way back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, though that was for very different reasons. I was offered to read this updated version, but because that is not what is available for you to buy right now, I turned that down. I always have to review what is currently available to readers. But hey, just so you know, that is additionally a thing that is happening. But I kind of hope some people still, at least if they're willing and knowing going into this, start with the original version so that they can see what I did, which is someone learning and honing their craft. I kind of was reading The Wandering Inn at a certain point, almost like for one of those series on YouTubes where you watch someone like try to learn piano in 100 days. I watched this author learn how to tie in their conflicts, do better character relationships, and develop a world in a more nuanced way beyond follow one of the most obnoxious main characters I've come across in recent memory screw up for 10 chapters. I cannot emphasize enough how much the first 10 chapters of this book are just watching Erin screw up.
As previously established, she's had to deal with goblins, there's a skeleton walking around, it's a threatening bad place. After slicing open her hand and spending way too much time dealing with that in horribly inappropriate ways, she's going about trying to prepare another meal after magically getting food stuff, because otherwise she would die because she's so wildly incompetent. And someone knocks on the door, so she opens it without questioning it at all. Maybe she would ask important questions. Maybe she'd be intelligent enough, have the wherewithal to be curious about her situation. But after they leave, we're just back to her foraging, back to her doing nothing. She didn't lock the door. Not only did she not ask questions, not only did she fail to figure out even the smallest bit of her surroundings, aside from just going outside and vomiting repeatedly and getting acid blood on her, but after the Drake and the giant Ant-Man left, not like a Paul Rudd Ant-Man, but like an actual Ant-Man, she went to sleep with the door unlocked, and now like a wraithy skeleton's trying to break in, that she wouldn't let in, even though she just talked about how she's gonna be running an inn. So she's just profiling this skeleton as being bad. Wasn't a spooky skeleton, which, good, to be honest. There'd be too many spooky skeletons. But it was a wizard who, for some reason, approaching this inn, didn't just approach it like a normal person and instead try to do these scare tactics.
We don't learn too much about who she is. We do not learn too much about the world around her. We do not get introduced to many more interesting characters. She tries to survive in this inn and does a bad job of it without much greater context for like this long, if not longer, for a Murderbot measurement comparison. But like a mythic AI in some sci-fi story improving itself and becoming better, The Wandering Inn throughout this first volume really begins to take form. And yes, that world slowly loads into the story and greater concepts and actual themes are introduced. Instead of having to watch someone screw up gutting a fish for far too long, we do end up meeting a couple local guardsmen, and there's a greater mystery about how more people are showing up in this world introduced, and a scoundrel wizard who is on the run because he dabbles in the necromancy. And by God, by the end of this volume, there's a full community cast of characters with well-defined dynamics, conflicts overcome, and it's not well written.
Finally, things are picking up. Oh my God. It's interesting. So we've had those guards, the Drake and the Ant-Man, return, and they found out that the wizard is a necromancer who's been on the run. And necromancy in this world is a big no-no, punishable by the death penalty. But Erin, being a somewhat decent person, doesn't want this person killed. Even though someone who's a necromancer, I mean, depending on how necromancy works in this world, probably should be killed, but anyway. So now there's like this conflict where there's actually like established character and interesting, you know, consequences for actions. Even the missing skeleton was resolved by being stolen by the necromancer, most likely for the skeleton we saw pounding at the door. His motivations for doing that, still very unclear, but it's coming together. It's not great. It's not even necessarily good, but in comparison to the first 10 chapters, suddenly I'm having a pretty good time.
That is the one area where the prose, you can tell this is a series that's been averaging thousands of words a day without much refinement or revision. If that does not bother you, if you are not a prose snob, you're probably going to have a way easier time getting into The Wandering Inn, assuming you can get past the first. But eventually, those stumbling prose begin working. And perhaps that is something that will continue to improve in later volumes. Maybe by volume 5, by the time you've read a Malazan worth of The Wandering Inn, The prose could match Malazan. I don't know, I haven't gotten there, but that's kind of beautiful. I really love that this is a two-story in one situation, where not only is The Wandering Inn successful because, yes, it is cozy fantasy that after it gets on its legs, I would say from the point I got to at the end of Volume 1 is an average execution of it, but you're also being invited into a community who every week gets to talk about and engage with another chapter, a new story. There's another one coming out at this date that's posted on the website. In many ways, and I think it's actually handling it kind of well, The Wandering Inn is the future of storytelling on the internet, at least the ways I'm seeing younger readers like Gen Z look for their stories. I know we're getting into a generation conversation, just bear with me here.
I feel like the fact that there's 12 million words is incredibly indicative of the cons of this series. It's unrestrained. It is stream of consciousness fantasy. It is just go, go, go. What can I pull from this genre and put on the page? Then it starts to focus and get some actually interesting scenes down. But there's so much more to come, it feels unwieldy, and the lack of direction outside of these smaller individual conflicts so deep in, it starts to feel almost just wild. Like, what could possibly come that's going to make this level of investment for such a small reward this deep in worth it? I really hope I find something.
Wandering Inn is a part of a new generation of stories that are breaking ground online, who are telling themselves as they're getting feedback from their readers, as their authors are improving, and as they're able to hire more, edit, improve. It's like this new wave of how fantasy and science fiction is going to find its audience. What's happening here with The Wandering Inn is the future of science fiction and fantasy storytelling. Not in the sense that like publishers are gonna go away or that everyone's gonna start adapting this, but it is a very new way to tell a story in the day and age of the internet that has been around for a long time, essentially since people started just putting crap up on blogs, but refined. And we're literally seeing that refinement happen as the volumes go on and the IP grows. Editors are being brought in, I assume, and greater teams are around this to manage the IP to the point where if a reviewer puts out a negative tweet, someone on the team can reach out to him and be like, hey, here's what's going on in the community right now. This is community storytelling where people can come together every week or 2 weeks, however often they're putting out these chapters, and engage with it, consume it, give feedback, and talk with each other. It's an active fandom, which is crazy to me. You get to see the author improve, the team grow, and the community balloon out into something that has merch and is probably working for adaptations. And if you are an author looking for success, The Wandering Inn is absolutely an avenue that you should look at because it's becoming more viable online as the newest generation grows up, who is kind of keen for this type of, yeah, you don't need to edit as much or refine it as much, but just give it to me storytelling so that they can engage with followers, speculate. It's in that online ecosystem.
I'm home now, and I just finished chapter 16, and I had my first moment in the book where I went, I liked that part. We're now just following a character in first person off on like typical dungeon quests, and there's also a runner who insists on running barefoot who's Asian. Nothing gets cut.
It's not my cup of tea, but I respect the out of the dedication and effort that goes into putting out 12 million words. I know, and I agree with to an extent, there are a lot of people who are just going to say this is spewing out a story. They're not wrong.
All right, well, turn it on. I'm very thirsty.
But I don't think that's as negative a thing as some people are going to make it out to be. It's just a new form of storytelling. It kind of reminds me of like the old days when like people would just gather around the fire and the storyteller would come and tell a new story and then go back and then the next day they'd do it again. Like it's just this, all right, story time. Kind of summarizing a lot of what I've said here, I think The Wandering Inn has successfully, as corny as it may sound to say, become an inn for its readers. It is a place to return to for what you expect, what you know will come, to continue a story with characters you care about. But I don't think fans will defend it as like the most pristine high literature, and instead we'll probably talk about it as something they just need to help them get them through their week. And of course there's something special and nice about that, something I can really appreciate. If I had to rate just the story of The Wandering Inn, personally, it would be about a 3 or a 4 to me, which sounds really negative, and yeah, that's my preference. I much prefer something a bit more refined in terms of cozy fantasy. I think it's still to the end of the first volume was struggling to establish an atmosphere very well. The characterization was obnoxiously shallow, but then again, I assume as it goes on, maybe by the 10th volume, if I was willing to commit that much to Wandering Inn, which I'm not, that could be absolutely something the author again improves on. And so there's a shift of this kind of spotlight here where in 20 years after every bit of feedback's been given and the stories continue to be edited and changed as the author gets better and looks back at what they've done, we get a final definitive version of The Wandering Inn. And Pirate ABA is settled and happy with their vision. But as of now, we are seeing The Wandering Inn being told as an active creative process everyone can jump in on, discuss, and contribute to. Not in the way where like everyone's giving their edits back to the author, but I'm sure they're seeing responses and they're able to engage with a community. And from that angle, that level of fascination for me, cranks Wandering Inn at least to just staying on my radar. I'm going to be checking in to see what's going on. And maybe years from now when I hear that there is a definitive, condensed, edited, sleeker version of The Wandering Inn that instead of being 12 million words is probably more in the ballpark of 5, which is still longer than Wheel of Time, or maybe not. Maybe it'll be even longer. That's okay. Not going to be on my TBR then, but I'm sure some fans do want that. I'm aware this is a not super focused review of a story. That's because there's just honestly not much to say here about the story, aside from I really do like that chess was involved heavily. I don't think it even represented, at least from what I've gotten so far, the lit RPG genre super well in the comparison to like Dungeon Crawler Carl. Just no, it's not even elevating those elements. But again, with 12 million words ahead of me, it potentially could. And there's a spectrum to all of this. You have just trad books put out, a space I'm trying to push into now, where it's just completely a relationship between an editor, a publisher, and a writer. You have things like what Sanderson's doing, where he's putting out special editions, engaging with an audience, and running this online environment, but keeping the story to himself. You have stuff like my publisher, Bryce O'Connor, who puts out his chapters on Patreon, and you kind of get to see that development angle. And then you have on the far end, The Wandering Inn. You get chapter by chapter, just go, go, go. And yeah, we'll improve stuff later on, but it's about the experience of getting the story told. That's really interesting. Even if this isn't your cup of tea, maybe just look into the community around The Wandering Inn to see more what I'm talking about, because it's special. I like that we are in this flux point in fantasy, science fiction, and just literature, speculative fiction, storytelling as a whole, where there's greater freedoms and avenues because of the internet. I'm sure some purists and snobs are going to hate it. And typically don't believe people on that side of things turn out to be right. And Wandering Inn certainly is suffering from being on the cutting edge in some ways, but I also really like that it's there. And I think in hindsight, it'll be looked at something that in 50 years down the road, when a bunch of people inspired by this insane level of success online are then writing their own version of it and are able to avoid many of the mistakes made. That's badass, and for that reason, I'm actually going to be giving The Wandering Inn, despite its very low rating from me, a badass seal of approval. And maybe after I try my trad journey publishing and I get a few books out there, I'll want to come back one day and try this other new version of publishing, where I come back and engage with you all chapter to chapter, week to week, in putting out a story. That could be really fun and not something I'm in any way, shape, or form inherently against. I mean, heck, there's chapters, some of my writing that probably won't ever see the light of day on my Patreon right now. I'm already in it and I didn't even know it. But like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And am I completely wrong? Do you think no, literature should be this just linear space, straightforward story conceived and never put out till it's done? Or does this kind of stuff interest you, where the more raw creative process is accessible to anyone and everyone who wants to dabble on in it? Let me know in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here, and have a good one, y'all. Peace.